Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversation Series, The Economic Crisis.
Welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation Series on the economic crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University. With us here today, we have Professor Barry Eichengreen, who is Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. And Professor Eichengreen is here with us today to speak about the unfolding economic crisis. And we want to do so today from an historical perspective. So first of all, Professor Eichengreen, thank you for being here with us today. And perhaps as a way to start our conversation, a simple question. So how does the current crisis compare to the crisis of the past?
Well, this economic and financial crisis, in my view, is indeed the most serious one we've had in 80 years. Many people draw comparisons with the Great Depression of the 1930s. I think those comparisons are appropriate given the depth of the downturn, the extent of financial distress, and the global nature of the economic crisis, both then and now. There have been many economic and financial problems and crises between the 1930s and today, but not a crisis that has infected the entire world to the same extent. The other thing I would say is that this crisis, in an important sense, resembles financial crises before the 20th century more than the kind of crises that countries have experienced in the last 50 or 60 years, in the sense that the last 50 years of financial crises have typically been precipitated by, associated with imbalances in macroeconomic policy, monetary and fiscal excesses. This was a crisis driven by a bubble in private financial markets. Regulation played a role, and indirectly monetary policies played a role as well. But fundamentally, this was a crisis, I think, grown in the private sector, in the banking systems of the United States and the other advanced economies. And in that sense, it resembles some crises that we experienced in the 19th century more than what has happened since 1945.
Can you give us examples in terms of crises from the 19th century which would have similarity or present similarities compared to this current crisis?
Well, the United States, perhaps not incidentally, is, for me, a prime case in point that we in the U.S. had a whole series of bubbles followed by panics and crashes in 1873, in 1884, in 1893, in 1907. Sometimes driven by irrational exuberance about the prospects for railroadization or for electrification, new technologies, and unstable financial markets combined pretty much in all of those episodes to breed financial instability. The further problem being that we in the U.S. didn't have a central bank to act as a lender of last resort, or a government with the scale and the resources to step in when necessary.
So you are saying that there is something in the nature of the American economy which makes the American economy prone to bubbles.
Well, it's an interesting question whether we in the United States are more prone than most. We have no shortage of animal spirits in the United States, if you want to invoke Keynes's famous phrase. And in the 19th century, like recently, we had lightly regulated financial markets to the extent that banks and markets were regulated. The banks were regulated by a proliferation of different regulators. We didn't have centralized regulation. Banks could shop for their regulators to an extent, either the national authorities or the state authorities. And there was the belief that ultimately proved mistaken in the 19th century, and I think has been proven mistaken once again, that markets can be trusted to regulate themselves.
So in the 19th century, there was a lack of unified system of regulation, which accounted for the generation of or the production of bubbles. But I mean, we are not really in this situation now because we have more or less unified system of regulation in the US. So why the return of the bubble, if you will?
Well, what we saw starting in the 1970s really was a move away from the tight regulation of markets and financial institutions that had been put in place here as a result of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So we began to deregulate the interest rates that could be paid on bank deposits. Banks had to compete for deposits by paying higher interest rates. They moved into riskier investments to pay the bill. They began to turn to the wholesale money market to fund themselves at lower cost. We deregulated the brokers' commissions for trading stocks that had allowed broker-dealers like Bear Stearns to make a comfortable living, comfortable and
more than comfortable.
And so institutions like Bear Stearns began to move into riskier lines of business in order to survive. We eliminated the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 that had separated safe deposit-taking commercial banking from riskier investment banking. And that intensified competition within the U.S. financial system, created conflicts of interest, and forced financial institutions to lever up their bets in order to survive. The other thing, so that's, to my mind, one of the processes that brought us to where we are today. The other point, though, here I would disagree with the premise of your question a little bit, is that we've always had a large number of different regulators in the United States. State commissions regulating state banks, and the Federal Reserve, or the FDIC, or the Office of Thrift Supervision, or a variety of other entities regulating banks. AIG was regulated by the State Insurance Commissioner of New York, and another part by the State Insurance Commissioner of Delaware, and so forth and so on. We had the absence of a centralized regulator. We had inadequate cooperation and coordination amongst regulators. And I fear, as a result of the Obama administration's plan released day before yesterday, we will only move partway down the road toward more centralized, effective regulation.
So you are both an economist and political scientist. So, I mean, when it comes to the political landscape, the political structures of the US, do you think that these structures, this landscape, account for this lack of unified regulation today? And can you relate political dynamics and dynamics having to do with regulation?
Well, number one, it is true in the United States, as it is in many other countries, that the financial sector is a powerful lobby. It has a lot of constituents, and it makes campaign contributions. The community banks in the United States oppose the idea that they should be regulated by the Federal Reserve or another institution located far away from them in Washington, D.C. And they're an example of a set of institutions that pushed back against the effort to centralize regulation. in response to the crisis. In addition to that, I think we have an unusually powerful ideology in the United States that markets are the solution and government is the problem, that markets tend to get it right. And that ideology, for better or worse, drove deregulatory policies, drove deregulation to go too far, I think, especially in the first 8 years of the present decade.
How would you explain this or account for this ideology? Because in the end, the market, it's a construct. So how do you account for such a powerful ideology in America?
Well, the question of why there is no socialism in the United States goes back much longer than I. But I back to the time of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. I think it is quite striking how deeply embedded that ideology and ethic is in the United States, even 2 centuries later. So we have just had a powerful demonstration of how markets can get it wrong, and about the importance of the government stepping in stabilizing fashion when things do go seriously wrong. And now there is a considerable effort already to begin to roll back role of government and be sure we continue with light touch regulation in the U.S. And I'm worried by the extent of the pushback and what it implies for the future.
Before we get to this, one more question on the bubble concept or pseudo concept. I mean, so beyond America, I mean, do you know of other economic cultures, if you will, where bubbles happen in a relatively frequent fashion in Europe, in Latin America, or elsewhere? I mean, is the bubble phenomenon essentially American, or do we have it happening elsewhere?
Well, I think this enthusiasm for taking bets on markets is not specific to the United States. So people in different societies tell stories about the enthusiasm they have for the lottery or for gambling or for taking bets, or for that matter, for financial markets. So in Japan, everybody talks about Mrs. Watanabe taking bets on the foreign exchange market. There are and Japan famously had a housing bubble and then collapse in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I think I would really emphasize policy more than I would emphasize culture in thinking about bubbles. Most of the bubbles we see, though, occur in very lightly regulated financial systems. In Japan, they deregulated. They tried to do a financial big bang to turn Tokyo into an international financial center in the late 1980s, and unintended consequences follow. In Europe, where we saw banks take on even more leverage in the last 8 years than in the United States, there was a process of financial deregulation and integration as part of the single market, in which European banks had to lever up their bets in order to compete. And the consequences there included, in many countries, frothy asset markets and booming housing markets.
But still, it seems to me that the role of the market, of the stock market, for instance, from one country to another varies quite a bit. I mean, in Europe or even in Asia, the stock market doesn't have the kind of iconic centrality that it has in America. So I guess that the function of the stock market varies from one type of economy to another. So, I mean, could you talk about this a bit?
Well, it is quite remarkable to see the number of people who watch financial news networks in the United States. I think that the explanation for that is a practical one. namely the extent to which households in the United States manage their own pension money and their own retirement accounts.
Yeah.
So, their investment decisions matter for their retirement. When the stock market collapses as it did last fall, that affects people's retirement plans very directly, unlike in other countries where the idea that individuals rather than the state should manage people's pensions and retirement accounts wouldn't be allowed to go so far.
So precisely, would you say that in America, more than in any other country, the fate of individual lives is linked to the fate of the stock market? I mean, it's certainly not the case in Europe or in Japan. I mean, the connection seems so strong here, but it's also a huge risk for the society.
Yes, I do worry about this. The data that I've seen do confirm that a larger share of households are invested in the stock market in the United States than in any other country through their retirement accounts. So that makes the ups and downs of the market matter. It assumes that individuals know how to manage that money prudently rather than concentrating it in the stocks of their own employer, for example, in which case they have no diversification or protection against risk if their employer goes out of business. So yes, I do worry about this. There's been talk in the U.S. over the last 10 years about privatizing Social Security, the remaining public retirement program. I hope this crisis will be taken as a caution against moving down that road.
But why, as a society, take so huge risks?
Well, because people lose sight of risks when things are going well. We haven't had a stock market crash of this magnitude in many, many years, and memories are short. Together with the fact of the ideology I described to you before, the idea that markets get it right and government gets it wrong more often than not. That is a peculiarly American view of society that perhaps will be restored to better balance as a result of recent events.
Turning to the present and the future, you seem to be a bit skeptical about how the crisis is being managed and what it is going to mean for the future. So could you give us your assessment of how the crisis is being managed at the US level but also globally, and what you think are based on your historical knowledge and expertise, what is likely to happen, what are the potential scenarios?
Well, I think first of all, our monetary and fiscal policy makers, not only in the United States but globally, have done quite a good job in responding to the crisis, acting as lenders of last resort and supporting demand through increased public spending when necessary. And that's a dramatic difference from the abject failures of macroeconomic policy in the 1930s. Secondly, we've done a reasonably good job of maintaining open markets in the face of the crisis. So there has been a dramatic decline in trade, whose sources I don't think we entirely understand. Part of it is murky protectionism of the Buy America variety. Part of it is disruptions to the supply of trade credit. Part of it, I think, reflects the fact that production has grown more fragmented over time, so that when we are buying in the United States one fewer imported car, that means not only that German exports of BMWs go down, but Slovakian exports of the frame of the BMW to Germany goes down as well. But I think by and large, we've done a reasonable job of avoiding protectionism, certainly by the standards of the 1930s. Where we've done an especially poor job, I think, is in managing financial instability. So there was the failure to deal well with AIG and its counterparties last spring. There was the failure to deal well with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers last fall, which really brought the world to the verge of a financial meltdown. And I think now we are doing at best a mediocre job of recapitalizing our banks and taking the toxic assets off their balance sheets, both in the U.S. and in Europe. I am, on the other hand, positively impressed by the extent of international cooperation to give the International Monetary Fund more resources and to try to cooperate on other issues as well through the Group of 20. So to my mind, one of the single most important byproducts of the crisis is the fact that the Group of 20 has emerged as the main steering committee for the global economy, when the Group of 7, Group of 8 meets like it did a couple of weekends ago, no one notices anymore.
But the G20 doesn't seem to be so eager to really, at least this is the argument that we hear from developing countries, doesn't seem to be so eager to really offer a substantial stimulus package to really help developing countries. In fact, this morning we're speaking with people from the IMF, and so what is your take on precisely the issue of the stimulus package and what could be done to really help developing countries alleviate the impact of the crisis? Because this is something which is going to be debated quite a bit next week in the context of this UN conference.
There are two types of developing countries in two very different positions. On the one hand, we have countries like China and Korea and a variety of others with policy room for maneuver, which have used it aggressively, and I think quite impressively. So they have foreign reserves. They came into the crisis with balanced budgets, and they have applied fiscal policy stimulus appropriately and I think effectively. On the other hand, we have a variety of developing countries in a weaker position. Typically, these have been natural resource and agricultural exporting countries that have been, their terms of trade have been hit very strongly by the crisis. Their access to foreign capital has been hit as well. So yes, I would like to see us move forward with the new allocation of special drawing rights through the IMF. I would like to see those resources going to the poor countries that need them the most. And I would urge the U.S. Congress, for example, which has shown some reluctance to approve those kind of measures, to see that it's not only in the United States where we have an economic and financial crisis, but in the poor countries of the world as well.
And do you think that it is likely to happen? And second of all, what could be the leverage of developing countries to make their case? Because I mean, I guess the case has to be made. So how do they what kind of arguments do they put forward so that their case is being heard at the global level?
I think we need to be reminded again that no country, not even the United States, can be an island of prosperity and in a depressed sea. That we in the U.S. and in the advanced countries depend for our own prosperity increasingly on the developing and emerging world. So, if you will, we in the U.S. can't decouple from the developing and emerging world. We're going to have to work together on a wide variety of issues, from security to climate change, and to tell developing countries, go off on your own and solve your economic problem, but on the other hand, cooperate with us on climate change, carbon emissions, and so forth, I think would be counterproductive. The other thing I would say is that the emerging countries in the group of 20 have made clear that they want to have a voice in global discussions and in strengthening the global economic and financial architecture. What they need, in addition, is a vision and a common set of positions, how they would modify the operation of the global financial system differently than U.S. policymakers, for example. And I haven't heard that vision yet. I would applaud, for example, the fact that Russia, China, India, and Brazil got together last week to talk about common positions. Now I would like to see more concrete proposals on what to do about replacing the dollar, supplementing the dollar with special drawing rights, and other ideas as well.
But precisely based on what you know of history, based on your long study of past crises and so on, if you were in their shoes, what would you put forward in terms of ideas as a possible alternative to the current system and its pathologies or shortcomings?
Well, I think we need strengthened global oversight of national policies. We need a more effective International Monetary Fund that can tell even big countries like the United States that its policies are out of line, its financial markets are not being prudently regulated, and it is relying too much on foreign finance. The IMF needs to be independent from its principal shareholders, including, not least, the United States. It needs more legitimacy. So governance and voting rights in the fund need to be reformed. I think that would be one important step. Number two, emerging and developing countries need to strengthen their regional arrangements. Asia has been moving down that particular road, but I don't think its Chiang Mai initiative of providing financial supports within the region is really effective or operational yet. It wasn't used in November of 2008 in response to the greatest financial crisis in 80 years. So Asia needs to operationalize that arrangement as well, give it an independent secretariat that can take hard decisions and lend money. Latin America can do a similar thing through FLAR, which is up and running in that region. So too, I think, can Africa. And I think at the national level, the important lesson of this crisis is go slow on financial deregulation, upgrade your arrangements for supervision of financial institutions and markets. That needs to be done at the national level around the world.
Just to follow up on your first point regarding the need for the IMF to really take on, quote unquote, the US. I mean, how do you manage to have the IMF being able to say harsh things, I mean, but perhaps necessary things to the US, having in mind the weight of the US?
Well, you don't accomplish this easily would be the first point. But my proposal, which I made with 3 co-authors way back in 1999, was for an independent and accountable IMF. So central banks at the national level are independent. They can move quickly to act as lenders of last resort. They can step in when they have regulatory authority and make hard decisions about the viability or not of a particular financial institution. I think ultimately we will have to move toward a world where the management of the IMF is independent of the principal shareholders, where there is a fair and legitimate and open process to select the managing director and the deputy directors, and they will be able to operate more like the Monetary Policy Committee of a central bank. They will authorize their staff to issue hard-hitting reports, and they will be able to decide on their own authority when it's appropriate to engage in last resort lending. So when we made this proposal back in 1999, the response was, the IMF is not like a central bank. It has many other responsibilities as well. It would be hard to hold its independent management accountable for its actions, given the multi-dimensional nature of its mandate. Well, what we've learned from this crisis is that national central banks have multi-dimensional mandates as well. They intervene in all kinds of markets. They're involved in all kinds of operations. If this can work for a national central bank, I would suggest ultimately it can work for the IMF as well.
If we had an IMF which would have a better governance system, do you think that such IMF should say to the US, look, you know, your public debt, your deficit is incredible and it's creating some systemic risk, and this has to be addressed? Do you think that it would be one of the things that it would be able to address with the US?
Ultimately, I think we will get there. But the other part of your question implicitly is, will the U.S. listen, and will it adjust its policies in response? Down the road, when the U.S. is less dominant economically and financially, when the dollar loses its exorbitant privilege as the world's only significant reserve currency, I think the U.S. is going to have to listen more closely to international financial markets, just like developing countries have had to listen carefully to what the markets say and respond to them. And when the IMF says something that gets the attention of financial markets, that ultimately will get the attention of the U.S. government as well. So will this happen tomorrow? No. Will it happen next year? No. But I think 20 years from now, when the U.S. is one of a handful, 6 or 7 or 8 economic powers in the world economy, we will have to listen.
Because so this is the way you see things going. That is to say, not having any more 20 years down the road, the U.S. really dominating the international landscape.
Yeah, I think it's clear that we are moving toward a more multipolar world economy. The sheer size of China and India's populations suggests that this is the case. If you combine the size of those populations with the realistic prospect that their economies can grow by 6 or 7 or conceivably 8% a year for the next 20 or 30 years, that alone means the world will be more multipolar 20 years from now, and hopefully there will be another cohort of poorer countries following their example. So the way that we have arranged the global economy with the United States and the dollar in a singular position, I think will have to change. And the way we've arranged international cooperation, where the U.S., by virtue of its 17% voting share in the IMF, has had effective veto power over changes in the fund's constitution, will have to change as well.
Perhaps a last question. We are reaching the end of our conversation. I was reading one of your latest articles. I think the title was The Last Temptation of Risk, in which you say that in fact it's not that we don't have the theoretical tools to understand in the field of academia when it comes to economics to understand what happened. It is that we don't really call upon all the tools that we have at our disposal. So could you elaborate a bit on this, on quote unquote the failings of of economics as an academic field in terms of predicting what happened and perhaps for the future forecasting what is likely to happen?
Well, I was having the oil changed on my car yesterday, and the person who worked there knew I was an economist. And I said, I'd almost hesitated to tell you that. He said in response, at least you're not a banker. My point being that I do think that the crisis ought to cause economists to reflect on their own failings as well. I think our failing was not an inability to see that markets could be unstable. We have theories of asymmetric information and agency problems and behavioral finance, which can help us understand very well how markets can be unstable, how investors can run with the herd, how excessive risk-taking and instability can result. But many economists allowed themselves to forget those lines of work and didn't insist that policymakers pay attention to them either when times were good. So many investors ran with the herd when markets were booming. Many economists went along when there were consulting gigs and conferences to attend as the hired entertainment. I think we need to do a better job as economists reminding ourselves that we don't know everything and that our advice is not always correct. I have hope that economics is now becoming more of an empirical discipline. We have benefited from new information technology. Everybody has a computer on their desktop 100 times more powerful than the mainframe computer I was forced to use when I was in graduate school. The best young economists tend to do, many of them, empirical work nowadays, which is different from the fashion in previous decades. So I hope now economics will become more of a grounded empirical science, and that will mean that that we economists as well will become more grounded and more in touch with the economic realities of the world.
So you think that the crisis is going to contribute to really change, perhaps significantly, the academic culture of economy as a field?
Well, my point is that I think that change had already been underway as a result of the IT revolution, among other things. But you are surely right. The crisis is going to give it another nudge, and highfalutin theory out of touch with reality, I think, will not dominate the profession quite to the extent it has been allowed to in recent years.
Professor Barry Eichengreen, I really want to thank you for your time. I don't want to keep you any longer because I know that you have other things to do. So we were having a conversation today on the economic crisis from an historical point of view, and we were speaking with Professor Barry Eichengreen, who is Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. So Professor Eichengreen, thank you for your time, and really, if you happen to be in New York, please stop by and we will be happy to meet again.
With pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.